When I'm not busy crowdfunding my time machine research and development, I like to answer questions I get on YouTube. So let's get to it. What was the single most defining moment in your life that inspired you to play and learn guitar? I actually remember this one very vividly. I think, like I've mentioned before, I got kind of a late start in music. I believe I was a junior in high school, and I had never played any kind of instrument. I don't even think I'd ever even touched a guitar up until I was like 17 years old. And somebody in my history class did like a report, like a presentation on Jimi Hendrix, and they kind of played a little bit of Hendrix music, and they kind of took some like footage from like documentaries and stuff. And I remember I was like just like very intrigued in a strange way because I usually didn't like anything going on in school. But that night I went out to the local Best Buy and I bought like the Experience Hendrix Greatest Hits things. And ever since then, I was just totally hooked. I was totally fascinated with trying to learn guitar. All of the stuff that I learned right away was Hendrix-related stuff, like my first year, pretty much. And then from that, I got into like Zeppelin and stuff, and then it just kind of took off from there. So it was interesting for me because I had absolutely no background of good music in general up to that point. Like, my parents listened to the worst music, the absolute worst music. Every road trip we were on, we would have to listen to like the smooth jazz radio, and it was just awful. Like, it was so awful. Like, I have permanent scars of smooth jazz in my life because of that. And then just being kind of like a 90s kid, I think, up until I got into guitar, I was just into like hip hop and stuff, whatever. I don't know. But yeah, definitely Jimi Hendrix kind of changed everything for me and led me on the guitar path. What is a typical time for a beginning guitarist with practice to be able to play with a band? Now, this is a really good question, and I think it's never too early to start playing with other musicians. Whether it ends up being a band or not is another thing, but, you know, whether it's 6 months in and just kind of be able to play chords on time, or a year in or 2 years in, everybody kind of develops at a different way depending on how much you practice. But I do think it's very invaluable to speed up your learning curve by jumping into the ring with other musicians. It's also just valuable as a learning experience besides your musicianship, just having to deal with other people, especially in a band construct, because you'll either develop like a really close bond with those guys or girls, and you know you might become lifelong friends, or what probably happens more than often is you end up meeting a bunch of loser musicians and you realize you probably don't want to be in a band in the first place. But that doesn't mean that you can't jump in and start doing it. Now, even if you kind of have like timing problems and stuff like that, you might not want to play shows until you get it like down really pat. And one thing to actually look for in a band is just playing with a solid drummer, because I kind of feel, as far as a live setting goes, the drummer has more of an impact on the sound of a band as a whole than any other musician, no matter what the setup is. Like, a bad drummer can submarine a bunch of awesome players, just as a really good drummer can kind of make mediocre players tighten up and play together. So if you're a guitar player or whatever, and you get a chance to play it with a good drummer, really just jump at it and take at it, because just being able to lock into something like that is an invaluable learning experience, and you're going to be really happy that you did it. Have you ever played any of the old American Peavey guitars? I've found them to be pretty high quality, and because they don't have a huge following, you can find them used for like $400 that sold up to $1,200 new that play and sound fantastic. Yes, this is actually right on point. So Peavey is a company that I think more like nowadays is known for their amps, like the 6505 and the Classic 30 and stuff like that, and their live sound stuff too. But yeah, back in the day, like in the 90s and stuff, they actually had some really awesome American-made instruments that are super cheap. I've actually even seen them go for less than $400 new. One of my students has like a 94 Peavey Predator, I think is the name of it. And to me, it plays just as good as like a US Strat. And the thing, you know, is like 20 years old, and it sounds fantastic. It actually has some pretty cool routing options on it too. So definitely, yeah, if you're looking to get kind of like a good quality used instrument, sadly they don't make them in the USA Peaveys anymore. Definitely go on eBay and try to snag yourself like a USA Peavey guitar, because I've seen them go for like less than 300 sometimes, which is awesome. Have you ever idolized a band or artist only to see them live and be like, wow, they blow? I know I certainly have. You know, for the most part, I've actually been really lucky. There was just the one time, which I've talked about before, where I went to see Andrew Bird, and he was kind of drunk, but honestly, he still sounded like okay. I mean, you could tell he wasn't quite all there. But another question that was asked was, what was the best and worst live show that I've ever been to? And I kind of wanted to talk about that for a second, because I think a really good live show is a combination of a great band and also the venue that you go to and like where you're like sitting or standing. Like if you go to an arena and you're in the nosebleeds, it can still be a good show, but it's not going to have the same impact for me personally anyways as me maybe being in like a smaller setting. Like when I lived in Las Vegas, they had this venue at the Hard Rock, which is actually like a pretty intimate setting venue, and they'd had some awesome bands come through. So the best sounding live show I've ever seen was surprisingly a band I had never even heard of. I went to go see the Hot Hot Heat, and the band that opened for them was a band called Louis XIV, and they were absolutely awesome. Never even heard of them. They just came out, and they just rocked it. It is the best live sound I have ever heard, and I distinctly remember it to this day just because it was so good. Usually with opening bands, like by the end of their set, I'm kind of ready for them to be done, but they rocked it like so hard, and all new music I've never even heard of before, been familiar with. It all sounded fantastic, and I think it was just a combination of like a pretty good band because they've been around for a little while, and just an awesome venue with an awesome sound guy that knew the band. Right, that stuff makes all the difference. Like some other live shows I've seen, like I saw Muse, which with pretty good seats in like a stadium, and that was awesome just because the seats were so good. And then I saw them on the same tour farther back in the stadium, and it wasn't nearly as good. It was the exact same show, pretty much the same set list and everything, but the seats made it from being like an incredible, unforgettable experience to one that was just kind of okay. If you're like taking a date to a concert, I would highly recommend you go see Coldplay. Coldplay puts on an awesome show. I saw U2 live. That was like another really big show. But again, I think it all comes down to like the venue and the sound guy, which kind of a pet peeve of mine is how in bigger shows with like a headlining act, it almost seems like a lot of times the opening acts are sabotaged by the sound. Like they never ever get the same volume as the main act does, which I guess is kind of understandable, but also they just never sound as good. Which kind of brings me to like the worst show. The worst sounding band I've ever heard was actually Kings of Leon opening for U2 in a stadium, and Kings of Leon was awesome, and this is actually like early Kings of Leon, which I loved their first album, but they sounded absolutely awful, and they were totally sabotaged by the U2 sound guy. Like you just couldn't hear anything. It was just awful. And that wasn't the only thing. Like I remember on the Black Keys St. Vincent tour, St. Vincent I guess was opening for the Black Keys, but I was kind of misled to think that they were like co-headlining. And Annie Clark's St. Vincent put on an awesome show, but again, it didn't have the same sound as the Black Keys did. So I think that's kind of messed up. Like if you're the headliner, you should be able to just blow people out of the water anyways. You shouldn't have to like sabotage the sound of the people that go before them. And I know it's not all that. Sometimes it's that, maybe the headliner has their own sound guy and they're not familiar. They don't get as long as mic check and stuff like that. But I think you might have even experienced something like that where the opening act just doesn't sound as good. And you can tell it's not the musicianship. It's actually kind of like the sound of it for whatever reason. Now, again, probably besides Kings of Leon, the worst show I've ever been to was Panic at the Disco. And this isn't really anything against Panic at the Disco, but I remember I was asked to go to this Panic at the Disco concert back in the day by like these 6 girls. And I was like, oh, sweet, like a concert with 6 girls. Like, this sounds great. Wrong. Worst experience of my life. I ended up being like in a mosh pit with all these emo dudes kind of being a bouncer for these 6 girls and trying to protect them from being groped. And just look at me, I'm not really the bouncer type. It was an absolutely awful experience. I was just kind of like looking around everywhere. These emo kids were totally out of control. And again, another thing that has kind of scarred me to this day, Panic at the Disco. Don't ever go with a group of girls. So for listening homework this week, as a shout out to that awesome band Louis XIV that I heard so many years ago in Las Vegas, I want you to listen to a song called Air Traffic Control. And again, this is one of those things, I bought the album right after I went to the show, and the album didn't do their live show any justice, but it's still pretty good. So definitely check out this track. Let me know what you think, and any comments or questions, leave them below, and I'll get to them as soon as I can. Thanks.